Hi, this is Dr. Michael Bordeaux, and I'd like to welcome you to the mini lecture on Africa in the early modern period. This lecture will take a look at Africa as it existed in terms of the 1440s and talk about the origin and evolutions of the transatlantic slave trade and the culmination of that in terms of the event we call the African Holocaust. If we take a look at Africa in the early modern period, the beginnings of European contact, early modern European contact with Africa, starts to take place approximately in the 15th century. The Portuguese, as we kind of talked about in terms of the New World lecture and the Age of Discovery, the Portuguese were the first Europeans to really kind of tackle sailing in the Atlantic Ocean on a consistent basis. And the driving overall goal of that exploration was to, of course, create a means of contact, stable contact, trading contact with the ports of India and the Southeast Asia in terms of China in order to kind of facilitate the Silk Route trade and replace the overland route with a sea route. So if we take a look at the story of Africa in this period, the beginning of African contact with the Europeans, and in this case the Portuguese, begins with the creation of trading posts and points of contact for the Portuguese explorers on the African coast. And the idea basically was that the Portuguese were the first people to sail down the coast of Africa, around the tip of Africa, which we call South Africa or the Cape of Good Hope, and to basically continue on and make trading contact with India and China. In order to do that, however, the Portuguese needed fresh water and they needed food supplies. And they engaged in trade with the coastal Africans in order to basically get those supplies. So, starting in the 1440s, we're going to have the beginnings of this Portuguese exploration, and we're going to have the connection of the Portuguese, as point number 2 talks about. We're going to have the connection of the Portuguese to what was at that point called the West African slave trade. And the West African slave trade is the slave trade that took place in that part of Africa that kind of juts out towards Central and South America. African trading had, in terms of slave trading, in that part of Africa, it had centered on the slave trade of Africa, starting as early as the medieval period and kind of culminating in the West African slave trade. However, the slavery that took place in West Africa is what we would call ancient slavery. It was based on an ancient slavery model, which means that the driving mechanism of slavery in West Africa was military conquest. According to the ancient kind of rights of war, there was a rule that was called basically the rule of spoil. And what that meant is if a country or if an army conquered another army, by the right of spoil, they would then have the option to taking that conquered army, the soldiers of that conquered army, and making them slaves, or as was the case sometimes, to ransom those slaves or those defeated soldiers back to their homes or back to their families in exchange for monetary payments. And so what drove the West African slave trade was in fact wars of conquest and the application of that right of spoil. However, what begins to happen, in the 15th century is that when the Europeans make contact with that West African slave trade, they are also going to engage in that slave trade. But it's not going to remain confined to West Africa. It's going to then become kind of evolve into what we call the transatlantic slave trade, with at the beginning minimal numbers of slaves being traded to the Portuguese and basically taken back to Portugal or taken on the remaining parts of the journey as part of the crew. Now, as part of this, of course, contact with Africa, the Portuguese would eventually create a stable colony on the southern tip of Africa, which we call the Cape of Good Hope. Now, Post 1492, as the slide kind of indicates, what we see after the arrival of Columbus in the New World and the creation of what's called New Spain, we see a dramatic increase in the need for free or slave labor. And that is then going to push the continued enlargement and evolution of the transatlantic slave trade from what it began at as in terms of very, very small numbers to being tens of thousands of Africans, millions of Africans in the 1700s. Just to kind of finish up the slide, in order to continue kind of that colonization of Africa, we have the Portuguese invasion of Congo in 1685 and the creation of more Portuguese-based colonies in southern Africa. Now, if we just take a look at the slide, I know it's kind of blurry, it's hard to kind of see. I blew it up to get an idea, but it's a representation of a slave vessel, and it happens to be a later slave vessel of the British government. And what it's supposed to show, and I do apologize for it being so kind of cloudy, is that the way that slaves were kind of chained to the boat to keep their movement and mobility to a minimum to allow for more slaves to be carried on the boat. And if you, I'll see if I can't get a better picture of this to load in so that you can actually see what it's supposed to look like. Now, if we take a look at the transatlantic slave trade in the 16th and 17th centuries, what we begin to see is we begin to see a dramatic increase in the number of slaves. Now, because the West African slave trade, basically located here, because that slave trade is basically going to be fueled by war, what we see happening is we see an increasing number of African tribes raiding into the interior part of Africa to gain more slaves to fuel the trade markets on the western coast or the transatlantic slave trade. Starting in the 16th century, we have the introduction of the Dutch into the slave trade. They're going to actually push the Portuguese out of the slave trade and monopolize it in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, when this happens, we see, beginning at this point, because of the demand increasing, we see an increase of the number of slaves traded, and because of a desire to more efficiently transport slaves in terms of numbers, we see a higher mortality rate among the slaves being transported. Now, as this picture indicates, the bulk of the slaves are going to go to Central and South America, New Spain, and of course, the Portuguese colony of Brazil. The bulk of the slave trading area is going to be here, as you can see, but the numbers are going to be predominantly on the coastal areas here and into the Caribbean, with a very small percentage of slaves going to North America. Just to give you an estimate in terms of numbers, in the year 1630, we see approximately 7,000 slaves transported and sold into slavery in the New World by the Dutch. So what started out as being maybe tens and then hundreds, by 1630 has evolved into thousands. However, unfortunately, that will just be the beginning of the horror that is the event we call the African Holocaust. The transatlantic slave trade really changes after the year 1713. We have that treaty I mentioned previously in previous lectures called the Treaty of Utrecht. And one of the stipulations of the Treaty of Utrecht is that the British gained the right, they gained the opportunity to sell goods or slaves in Spanish ports. And when that happens in 1713, we're going to see what happened to the Dutch. We're going to see the Dutch pushed out of the slave trade by the British. Now, when that happens, that's really when the transatlantic slave trade goes from being thousands of slaves to being hundreds of thousands of slaves to being millions of slaves. Under the British, shipping conditions reached their worst condition. the mortality rates among slaves reached the highest percentage, somewhere between 20 and 30% of the slaves lost per voyage. Now, what that basically meant was that it's during the British period of the transatlantic slave trade that slaves were chained to the boat and were not allowed to move at all unless to physically kind of move their extremities. They were not allowed to stand upright. They were not allowed to move at all within the actual cargo hold of the slave ship. And because of that, because of the shipping conditions, mortality rates from illness and from basically lack of mobility, that caused about 20%. Now, that could inflate to 30% if, for example, in terms of a percentage, an overall percentage, if a slave ship were to run aground or basically sink, in a lot of cases, horrifically, I mean, just to think about this is truly horrific, but in a lot of cases, the British sailors would abandon the ship and not release the slaves. And you would have 100% mortality rate of that slave ship, which would mean in reality that would equate to anywhere from 500 to 700 lives lost in that horrific tragedy. So in 1630, just to give you an idea in terms of population, in 1630, the average number of slaves sold in the New World was about 7,000. And by 1800, so from 1440 until 1800, we estimate that 7.6 million Africans were sold in slavery in the New World. 7.6 million. And we estimate that the total cost of life and freedom, the total loss of population to the African continent, we estimate that and it's a very low estimate, we estimate that it was approximately 12 million Africans. That does not include the loss of life that was basically created in terms of the warfare that drove the Western African slave trade. As the Western Africans moved to gain more and more slaves, that was driven by warfare. And so we have no way of really estimating the number of casualties in those wars to fuel the slave trade. I've seen estimates, and we don't have a good number, but I've seen estimates, and I think they're modest estimates that predict or that perhaps indicate that the loss of life, the total loss of life and liberty could have totaled 18 to 26 million Africans over the course of a 200-year period. And that's why when people refer to the African Holocaust, what we're referring to is that just unforgivable and shameful disregard for humanity and human worth, the loss of the African people of that massive population. And basically, and that's by 1800. I mean, the slave trade continued until 1865. And we have no way of really gauging with any degree of confidence how much the cost in terms of life and just stability was. When we talk about the effects of the transatlantic slave trade, really what we see is a threefold destabilization effect. The first destabilization is that we're going to have the rise of dominance and power among certain coastal kingdoms of Africa over other African areas that were perhaps in the past more powerful and dominant. Because the key to remember is that what's fueling this trade for the Africans is basically the trading of slaves for guns, for military weapons. And then what's fueling the other, what we call triangular trade, if you will, or the transatlantic slave trade, it's basically going to be guns from Europe traded in Africa for slaves, Slaves taken to the New World and traded primarily for sugar, also tobacco, other materials, but primarily for sugar. And then that sugar taken back to Europe, processed into not only regular sugar, but also processed into rum, an alcoholic beverage, rum, as well as other products. And then those products are then sold at a vast profit, which are then put back into guns and basically continuing the cycle. So we see a surge of power of these Western kingdoms. And then conversely, we see a destabilization and a complete draining of population of Central Africa, which is going to cause the interior African kingdoms to destabilize and pretty much to implode. And then the last thing that happens is that when the last kind of phase of destabilization comes in, when the transatlantic slave trade is outlawed post 1860 in the 1850s and 1860s, when that trade ends, we're then going to see a effectual collapse of the African kingdoms that were profiting from the slave trade. Their main source of income, their main source of trade that had kind of dominated their economy for over 200 years, suddenly and just completely collapses, which then forces those kingdoms into economic and political instability, which then forces the collapse of those kingdoms. If we take the totals of 1800, which we have good figures for, if we take approximately 12 million Africans captured and traded with an additional kind of just rough percentage-based idea of an additional 5 million of these Africans who died in transit in terms of being carried to the New World, we see just a very basic cost of human life in terms of 17 million. And that's not including all the Africans that could have and did die in terms of those wars of expansion that fueled this slave trade. We have no way of knowing. We estimate it could be anywhere from 20 to 30 million Africans, which is a truly sobering and staggering, just horrific effect upon Africa. And we know, based on documents, and obviously what's fueling this is economic greed, European economic greed, European ideas of what we call racial slavery. The Europeans are justifying this based upon their belief that the Africans are inferior, they're in fact less than human. And that is kind of giving them an intellectual foundation to base and justify their greed and complete disregard for human life. I teach a lot of different time periods of history, and I always kind of feel that it's definitely post 1500 that really we start to see truly horrific and just base examples of human emotion and human kind of selfishness and the way that humanity preys upon each other. We see it in this class, especially. We'll see it in the 1500s in the African Holocaust. We'll see it again in the colonization of the English in terms of the New World and their treatment of Native Americans. We see it again in the 1900s with what's called the Age of Imperialism and kind of the manipulation and just complete destruction politically and stability culturally of countries like Japan and China. And then, and last but certainly not least, we see just, I have no other way to kind of describe it, but just human evilness when it comes to the actions of both the German Holocaust of the Jews, the Jewish Holocaust, as well as the extreme genocide that takes place in the Asian world between the Japanese and the Chinese, the genocide that continued to take place in terms of racial cleansing that took place in Africa. And of course, the whole communist kind of Holocaust that takes place in Russia, which we estimate could have possibly been the largest, or at least one of the largest losses of life, totaling some over 100 million Russians. We also have an event which is called the Great Leap Forward, which was an event in China in which possibly anywhere from 100 to 150 million Chinese people died, starved to death because of poor government efficiency. The number of these events, the terms of casualties and just sheer loss of life is in the millions. And I think it's extremely hard to kind of conceptualize and wrap your mind around. But it also indicates, just in terms of world history, the amount of population growth that was becoming possible in the time period of our class from the 1500s to the 21st century. Before I end the lecture, I just want to mention also that with the loss of that population, of course, it made European colonization, both in the 15 and 1600s and again in the 1900s, late 1800s and 1900s, extremely easy for the Europeans to kind of dominate and control Africa. I hope this lecture has been informative. I am by no means an expert on the transatlantic slave trade or the African Holocaust. I guess the biggest message about this event is just the sheer selfishness and domination, and also kind of just destructive effects that this had upon Africa, the African people, and then, of course, its long-term rippling effects that are still felt in world history and American history today. I hope this lecture has been informative, and I look forward to speaking to you again on another topic and in another lecture. Thank you again for your time and watching this, and I look forward to speaking to you again.